Welcome everyone to ATAR Notes and the January lectures for BizMan. Before I head into our lecture today, just a heads up around all of the free resources that ATAR Notes creates, which range from study notes, lectures, videos, but there's a couple on the screen that you might be aware of. But they also make thousands of other study resources as well. And that is through ATAR Notes Plus. All right, so without further ado, let's get into our lecture for today. So, welcome to the 3 and 4 Business Management January lecture series. I am Anandi. A little bit about me. I graduated in 2021, so now 2 years ago, 2 full years ago, or nearly 3 years ago now. No, 2 years, 2 full years. And I got an ATAR of 96.25. For business management, I got a raw 44, and then I also got above 40 in HHD, further, and English as some of the other subjects that I did. I'm currently studying commerce at Melbourne University, and I am a strong animal lover. I have a dog, his name is Prince, and he's an absolute cutie. Okay, so how this lecture is going to work today, we're going to split it up into two blocks. The first block will be roughly around an hour. We'll be looking at a bit of an introduction towards Business Management 3-4, and then also looking at the first area of study in Unit 3, which is called Business Foundations. The second block will also take up roughly an hour, and we will look at the second area of study in Unit 3, and then we'll also look at studying tips. Just a heads up, remember that you do have this lecture recording and it's accessible to you at any time. You also have the slides as well, so don't stress with taking down notes, or if there's something that's covering the lecture recording, you can always access the slides and use that as a reference and as a guide. While you're watching the lecture recording, do please put any questions you have in the live chat. I will be going through them and I'll be answering any questions you might have. All right, so Introduction to Business Management. Welcome to Business Management. Some things that you should know. It's a good subject. It's a good subject to jump on, and especially to help boost your ATAR. Obviously, it's really dependent on how well you do in the subject, but I feel like if you stay on top of your work and you have a genuine interest in the content, then I'm sure it's a subject that you will score highly on and that will help your ATAR. It did carry me for sure. It's probably one of my highest subjects, so I really did like this subject. In reference to the exam, so at the end of the year, it's 2 hours of writing time as well as 15 minutes of reading time. So a fair bit, but I'm sure by the end of the year you'll have done a lot of practice and you'll get familiarized with its style through SACS as well. But that's just sort of for your knowledge, for your information. I know the exam is a while away, but it's good knowledge to have from the get-go. This is the second year of the current study design, so there were some minor changes to the study design last year. So just be aware of this when you are doing practice questions, because if you're doing exams, practice exams or practice questions from 3 or 4 years ago, it was a different study design. So there might be some questions that you might be unaware of, or that's just refer back to your current study design and make sure that it is something that you don't have to know, because there's no point doing practice questions that are related to the old study design, because that knowledge might not necessarily be required for the exam this year. So just keep in mind that this is the second year of the current study design. So when you're doing practice questions, you might come across some content or some questions that you're like, hey, I didn't learn about that in class. Most likely you don't need it, but always just double check. Okay, then this is a bit of a breakdown of the actual study design itself and the content. So Unit 3 is worth 25%. You have 3 areas of study under Unit 3. So we have Business Foundations, and then the second one we have Human Resource Management. We'll be looking at those 2 today. And then there's also a third one, Operations Management. Under Unit 4, this is also worth 25%, and you only have 2 areas of studies this time because you also need time to prepare for the exam. So they're a lot shorter as well. But first area study, reviewing performance identifying the need for change, and then the second area of study is actually implementing change. And then the exam is worth 50%. Okay, so why are SACs important? So your study score will be between 1 and 50, and it's based on your SAC scores and your exam scores. So you might be familiar with this if you did A3 and 4 in year 11, but yeah, your study score, your final study score is based on your SAC scores as well as your exam scores. And when you're given your final grades by VCA, when you're getting your ATAR, this is sort of like a bit of a breakdown of how you might get it. But you're going to get a score from E to A plus, and then depending on how well you did in Unit 3, Unit 4, your exam, and then after that you'll get your final study score, which will be between 1 to 50. Doing poorly on your SACs makes it very difficult to get a high study score. So try to be consistent. That's my biggest advice to you all with your 3 and 4 subjects, is just try to be as consistent as possible. Just because if you are able to maintain a high SAC score, and do well in your SACs, and you also therefore do well in your exam, it's very likely that you'll get a good study score. So try to be as consistent as possible, because if you do poorly on your SACs, it's going to have an impact on your study score, but also your preparation for the exam. Because if you learn the content when you're taught it, rather than learning it a month before the exam, it's going to make your life a lot easier. So try to spread out your workload and work efficiently rather than hard. Yeah, work smarter, not harder. That's sort of what I was getting at. Okay, so scaling. The most important thing to know about scaling is that it's not important. So the further away you are from the median score, the less you'll be scaled down. So if you get I think BizMan scales down by like 2 or 3. I'm not too sure. I haven't checked in a long time. But if you get a higher, the further away you are in terms of like the higher score you get, the less it's going to be scaled down. So if you get a 44, then it might be scaled down to a 43. If you get a 48, I don't think that's scaled down. So try to get the higher study score, means less scaling. There's less of an impact on your scaling. So some examples. So Raw 30 scales to 26, 38 scales to 36, and a 47 doesn't scale down. So that highlights the impact of, the higher study score you get, less scaling. Psychology, Raw 30 scales to 28, 40 scales to a 29. 39, that should be a 39. Don't stress about your subject scaling down. Just try to run away from it by getting the highest raw score you can. I think for me, I only took 2 subjects that scaled up and the rest scaled down. So it just shows you how scaling doesn't necessarily matter that much, because at the end of the day, if you do well in your subjects, if you get a good study score, it's not really going to have an impact. So most important thing is just doing well in the subjects that you're choosing to do and have, are genuinely interested and passionate about. Okay, if you did not complete Unit 1 and 2 of BizMan, you don't need anything from Unit 1 and 2. So it's not like, don't feel like you're missing out. It's completely fine. The way that the study design is structured for 3 and 4 ensures that you're taught the fundamental knowledge throughout. So don't feel like you're at a disadvantage. If you're in year 11 and if this is your only year 12 subject, do make it your focus. Remember that this has a direct contribution towards your ATAR. And if you're in year 12, good luck. And heads up, the further exam is always on the same day as BizMan. So if you're doing further as well, it's highly likely that you're going to have 2 exams on one day. So just keep that in mind. Good knowledge to have from the start of the year. Okay, now we're going to go on to looking at actually understanding the study design. So each area of study has a page in the study design that looks like this. So if you search up Business Management 3, 4, and VCA, then that's how you access this page. It's like a Word document or a PDF, but you can access the study design through the VCA website. And I cannot stress how important the study design is. I liked to use this as a checklist to ensure that I was learning the correct material in school and at home. But also, since the study design, changes every couple of years, you might come across practice questions that you're a bit confused about because you weren't taught that in school. So the study design is really good just to make sure that you're on track, you're learning the relevant content, and again, just using it as a checklist when you're revising for your SAC or your exam. Okay, so looking again at the study design, each area of study has one outcome task attached to it. These outcomes are the SACs. So when it says outcome, that's really just looking at the SAC outcome. Then we have key knowledge. This is the stuff that VCA wants you to know. So it's explicitly stating the actual required knowledge that could come up on the exam and your SACs. So that's specific, literally what you have to know. But yeah, it's a pool of stuff from which VCA can ask questions, and it's your ultimate guide. Even this bit, a lot of people forget this, but the little description of business foundations, that area of study, can also be a source of questions. It just describes what you're required to know, and yeah, again, what you can be tested on in the exam. Then we have key skills. So key skills, those are also really important part of the study design. It's often forgotten about. It's often neglected and ignored by students, but it indicates to you how VCA are actually allowed to ask their questions. So specifically what type of questions they can ask on particular topics. So it's good to keep in mind. And task words, again, knowing your task words are so important because different task words would require you to structure your answer differently. So do make sure that, that's sort of like the first thing you should be focusing on in BizMan is really understanding your task words so that when it comes around to answering questions, you know how to answer those questions. So for example, I'll go through a couple of task words now. So compare means you have to provide similarities and differences. The second task word is discuss. This is when you have to provide advantages and disadvantages. Describe means providing features or characteristics of a particular idea or concept. And then evaluate is providing advantages and disadvantages, but also including a final opinion. So don't forget that last bit. You have to include a final opinion. Evaluate questions are normally around 5 marks, and 1 mark will be dedicated towards providing that final opinion. So if you do not provide a final opinion, you will not be getting full marks. So that's a really key part of the evaluate task word. Okay, that is the introduction to BizMan done. I'm going to look at now moving on to the first area of study. So the first area of study is business foundations. So we're going to go through the task words, but in terms of understanding the task words, you can be asked to define, describe, apply, discuss / evaluate, and no case studies for every topic. So case studies is also a really important part of BizMan. You would be going through case studies in school, but yeah, just make sure that you have a couple up your sleeves for each area of study. And you'll also be asked to analyze and discuss management styles, characteristics of businesses, and corporate culture. Okay, so when we're looking at types of businesses, this is the first key knowledge point that we're asked. But we have 6 types of businesses. So the first type of business that we have is a sole trader. This is an entity, it's owned by a single individual. So a sole trader is essentially one person and they own the business. It's also subjected to unlimited liability, which just means that in the case that the business falls into debt, the owner's personal assets can be seized. We'll explore the concept of liability, I think, in the next couple of slides. But yeah, it's subject to unlimited liability, partnership owned by 2 to 20 people, and also it's subjected to unlimited liability. Then we have a private limited company. This is where we have shareholders between 1 to 50. So shareholders are not they are not like direct creators of the company, but yeah, they're sort of just their own varying levels of ownership to that company. And private limited company, they have limited liability. So this just means where the business, falls into debt, their shareholders or their owners are not held personally liable. They're only held to the percentage of their investment in the business. Then we have perpetuity. So this means that the business can continue to operate and continue its life even if the original owner, ceases to exist or they leave the company. Private limited companies, another really important thing to understand is it's not listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. So shareholders of private limited companies actually have to be invited to be shareholders. Not anyone can be a shareholder to a private limited company because it's not listed on the Australian Stock Exchange and they have to receive an invitation. Then we have public listed companies. So this is where we have 50 plus shareholders. Again, they have limited liability, so risk is diversified among the shareholders. And then perpetuity, again, can continue to exist even after the original owner leaves or ceases to exist. A good example of this is Apple. Steve Jobs, the original creator, the original founder of Apple, even though he passed away, Apple today still continues to be one of the biggest companies in the world. So that is an example of its perpetuity. It's also listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. So this is another characteristic of public listed companies because really anyone can become a shareholder. It is listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, which allows, the general public to see their listed stocks and to then, purchase, to buy shares and then become a part owner in that company. So if I wanted to right now, I could pull up the Australian Stock Exchange, have a look at Apple and purchase some shares right now, and I would be a shareholder to Apple. So that's why they tend to be such big companies. Then we have social enterprises. So this is where profits are distributed to a community cause. Remember that it's important to be really careful with your wording here. It's not just the community, it's specifically directed towards a community cause. So if you are asked to define social enterprise and if you say profits are distributed towards the community, that would be incorrect because it's a specific community cause that they're seeking to address or that they're seeking to distribute their profits to. Then we have government business enterprise. This is where the profits are returned to the owner, which is the government. The main objective of government business enterprises are to provide a service. So it's most often just to provide an essential service. Some examples of GBEs are Australia Post, Vic Roads. Those tend to be, fairly good and easy examples of government business enterprises because they're providing an essential service and any profits that are made are returned to the government. Okay, let's have a look at the advantages and disadvantages of each now. So with a sole trader, with the advantages is that it's a relatively low cost of entry. It's not that complex and it's not that costly to operate because, there's one owner, they can run the business themselves, and it's fairly easy, not too complicated. The owner has complete control over the business and can make all decisions. So really, as whatever vision the owner has for the business, they can make decisions accordingly. They have complete control over the business. And then the last advantage is that they retain all the profits. So they're in control of all the profits, how they want to distribute the profits, but they are able to keep all the profits. The disadvantages is that it has unlimited liability. So in the case that, the business is not successful and they experience excessive financial obligation and therefore, debt, then the personal assets of the owner can be seized in order to compensate for, that debt. And in that way, the owner bears all the losses, and the impact of those losses can't be distributed or shared with other owners. It's that sole owner who's experiencing all the burden. And then leads on to the last point is that they have the burden of management. Everything falls on them. So it's quite a lot of responsibility. And therefore, they might find it hard to take time off, to actually enjoy holiday. And it can be quite a lot to manage. All right, looking at unlimited versus limited liability. So unlimited liability, this is where the business and the owner, they're considered the same legal entity. So in this way, the business and the personal assets of the owner can be seized if the business cannot pay its debts. So that's a main disadvantage of traders, of sole traders and partnerships. While with limited liability, they are incorporated businesses. So the business and the original owners, they're considered separate legal entities, and therefore shareholders can only lose business assets and not personal assets if the business is unable to pay its debts. And that's the main advantage of companies. So really, with the companies, the shareholders are just losing their investment or the amount of shares that they hold in that business. So that's a key business asset, but their cars aren't going to be seized, their houses aren't going to be seized, none of their personal assets will be seized like they potentially can be in a sole trader or partnership because they're unlimited liability. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, then we have partnerships. So key advantage here is that there is a greater access to capital since there are now multiple owners contributing to the business financially, but also besides from the financial contribution, all of these owners have a variety of knowledge, skills, ideas, and experience in different areas. So they can draw upon that to help grow and benefit the business. One person might have experience in, one industry, another person might have experience in another industry. So in that way, they can provide very insightful advice to each other when they're making decisions. There's also shared responsibility and workload and risk between partners. So unlike a sole trader where one person bears all the burden, it's now spread out with a partnership because, everyone's going to take their own responsibility, have their own workload. So it's sort of distributed among them. It's much easier to set up in comparison to a company as well. The disadvantages is that the owners have unlimited liability. So again, personal assets can be seized. Possible disputes can also arise among the partners about workload, strategy, and money. So now since we have multiple owners, these owners might have different visions of the business. They might have different ways that they want to make business decisions, and that leaves room for potential conflict and, heads to clash. And therefore disputes can rise, and that can be quite time consuming to mitigate and navigate through. But that can, that's a potential disadvantage. Is not everyone, might not have the same vision for the business. There's also greater legal requirements in comparison to a sole trader. For example, lodging a partnership tax return, and it also lacks perpetuity. So if original owners leave the business, it's most likely that the business also might not be able to continue its life. Okay, then we have public and private companies. So key advantage here is that we have limited liability, we have perpetuity. Again, with limited liability, none of their personal assets of owners or shareholders are going to be seized, just their business assets. Perpetuity, the company can continue its life even if the original owner, the director or shareholder, leaves the business. The disadvantages is that companies are much more complex and expensive to set up. So since they are a bigger business structure, it's a bit more complex. And naturally also a bit more expensive as well. They have to register with the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, ASIC, And also companies experience a higher degree of government control and reporting requirements. So there's many legal requirements they have to abide by. For example, publishing their financial reports, their annual reports, their sustainability reports. There's a whole heap of legal requirements, extra legal requirements they have to comply by. Okay, little activity for you all. Which definition of a social enterprise is correct? So one of these is incorrect. Identify the one that is incorrect. Keep that in mind, but just have a read of both of them, both of the definitions, and have a think about which one is incorrect, and we'll go through the answer in a second. I'll give you 2 minutes to have a think. Okay, let's have a look. So the incorrect answer is, let's have a look at both of them actually. Yeah, so the first one, a social enterprise, is an organization that operates like a standard business, but with the objective of distributing its profits back to a community cause. The second one, a social enterprise, is an organization that operates like a standard business, but with the objective of distributing its profits back to the community. So this was the key pointer that I underlined when we were looking at social enterprises, but the incorrect option is the second one. So this one, because they have just said they have the objective of distributing its profits back to the community. That's incorrect. It has to be towards a specific community cause, because we have different social enterprises. You know, there's ones that focus on poverty. There's ones focusing on, including disabled people. There's one including, there's some looking at, animal welfare. So there's so many different types of social enterprises, but they're specific to actually different community causes, if that makes sense. Okay, practice question for you all. Outline one reason why a business may choose to operate as a partnership rather than a sole trader, worth 2 marks. So take some time. If you have a pen and paper, take this opportunity to have a go at answering this question. Since it's worth 2 marks, I'm going to give you all maybe 3 or 4 minutes to have a go at answering this, and then we'll go through the answer. let's have a look. So this is Vika's sample response. Let's have a read. So a partnership is a structure that can consist of 2 to 20 people and combines the expertise and capital of these people. They also have unlimited liability. However, a business may choose to operate under this structure, as it means there's more perpetuity for the business, in that even if one person leaves or passes away, the life of the business will still continue. If this were the case with a sole trader, the business would no longer operate. So really, you're looking at, I guess, justifying and outlining the reasons why a business would prefer a partnership over than a sole trader. But yeah, just underlining the advantages and I guess framing it in a way where it highlights its superiority, superiority over a sole trader, as this response has done. Okay, another little activity. 3 definitions. Have a look through all of them. Which one is incorrect? Give you like maybe 30 seconds or a minute just to have a read. And then mentally just make a note of what you think is incorrect. Okay, let's have a look. So notice the way that these definitions have been framed. So the first one is saying a partnership is a type of business that is owned by 2 people. Second one is saying it's owned and operated by 2 people, 2 to 20 people. And the third one is saying it's operated by 2 to 20 people. So the key thing in the definition of partnerships is that you have to include the word owned. But if you just include operated, that's not enough. You could say owned, you could say owned and operated. Either one is fine, but it has to have the word owned. Okay, now let's have a look at business objectives. So we have quite a few business objectives that we need to know, but we first need to understand what business objectives actually are. So business objectives are goals that provide direction, incentive, and purpose for management and employees within an organization. So they're really just objectives that provide a sense of direction, a sense of purpose for everyone within the business to, I guess, strive to in the organization. And so when we're looking at different goals, we have all of these objectives that we are required to know in the study design. So the first one is to make a profit. So fairly straightforward, but we know that profit is given by the equation of revenue minus expenses. So there are 2 ways a business can make profit. They can either increase their revenue or they can decrease their expenses. Then the second one is to increase market share. Market share is the percentage of sales that a business holds in a particular industry relative to their competitors. So if a business has high sales and if they are achieving more sales than their competitors, it's likely that they have a higher market share than their competitors as well, because it's all measured by sales. Then the third one is to improve efficiency. The concept of efficiency and effectiveness you'll learn more about in Area of Study 3 under Unit 3 when you're looking at operations management. So these two concepts will be a lot more clear towards the end of the year. But efficiency is how well a business uses its resources to create output. And then effectiveness is the degree to which a business achieves their objectives. Then we have to fulfill a market need. So any unsatisfied need, any niche in the market that currently isn't being fulfilled, sort of addressing that if there's any gap in the market as well. And then we have to fulfill a social need. So is there any community causes that need to be specifically addressed? So this would be a key business objective for a social enterprise. And then to meet shareholder expectations. So I guess just being transparent, making decisions in the interest of shareholders, sort of things like that. It's important to keep in mind with business objectives, not all business structures will have the same business objectives. So for example, with our sole trader and partnership business structures, they would not have the business objective to meet shareholder expectations because these business structures don't have shareholders. They only have owners. So if, in a SAC, you're asked to describe a business objective for a sole trader, if you talk about to meet shareholder expectations, that would be incorrect because sole traders don't have shareholders. So just something to keep in mind, I guess. Okay, then we have stakeholders. So when we're looking at stakeholders, it's really anyone with a vested interest in the performance and / or activities of a business. The keyword here is vested, but we need to know when we're looking at stakeholders, we need to know their interests, and we also need to be aware of how these interests might conflict or might be in conflict with each other. So these are some stakeholders that we need to be aware of. So the first stakeholder is employees. So their interest is in stable employment. So they want to have access to secure employment, have access to good wages and working conditions as well. Then we have management. So they would be interested in achieving good business performance because that just reflects positively and positively on them in terms of how well they've been doing their job. So obviously if the business is performing well, it would mean that, the manager is also performing well too. Owners / shareholders, so they would want to have high dividends. Obviously they want to achieve, in return for their investment in the business, they want access to higher dividends, which is what they get paid by the business. And so they would want high dividends, successful business performance as well. Then customers, they want access to high quality goods and services at reasonable prices. And they would want products to be marketed ethically. Obviously, they don't want to be deceived in any way. But yeah, just ensuring that the business is conducting its operations in an ethical manner. But also they don't want to be overpaying excessively for goods and services. So they would want it to be they would want access to that at a reasonable price, but also get the best of both worlds in terms of also achieving and getting a high quality product as well. Then we have creditors. This is just suppliers. It's really, creditors are sort of like the entities that lend money to the business. So they would want good performance of the business so that they get paid on time. Government, they want tax revenue, high employment, because, good business performance means that the business is generating more revenue, which means they're going to be paying more tax. So they're interested in tax revenue, and the business also performing well so that, they can continue to grow the business so that they're hiring more people. And then society, so low unemployment, socially responsible practices. So I guess the business having that social outlook on their impact on the community, because I guess that would be beneficial to society. So with stakeholders. I'm going to skip this one. Be careful. A common mistake is confusing the terminology of a stakeholder and a shareholder. So do make sure you read the question carefully, because a lot of people do tend to mix up between stakeholder and shareholders because they both start with an S and they both have the word holder in it. I remember making the mistake and getting confused between both of them when I initially was learning the content. So do make sure that you put in the required amount of practice and take the time out to actually fully distinguish and separate those two key terms, because so many students just drop marks because of silly mistakes like that. So do make sure that in a SAT question, if you're answering practice questions, if any question you're answering around a stakeholder or shareholder, you're highlighting keywords, you're rereading over your response, you're rereading over the question so that you are answering the question appropriately. You're not getting anything confused or mixed up, and you're referring to the relevant terminology. It's always important for this reason that you leave enough time at the end of your SAT to actually go back, quickly read through your responses, read through the questions so that you can avoid making silly mistakes and dropping marks because of silly mistakes. I feel like that's the worst way to drop marks because you know it, so that I feel like it's unfair that you're losing the mark because you know it and it's just a silly mistake. So in my opinion, it's like the worst way to lose marks. And even when I was, in year 12 and when I was doing SACs, it's the one thing that I would really beat myself over, because you know the content, but in the moment, because you weren't that careful, you unfortunately slipped up and had to pay the cost through a mark. And marks are precious, they add up, so don't take them for granted. All right, then we have to also be aware of conflicts. So as you can imagine, in the business, there's so many different stakeholders like the ones we've just quickly gone through, but these stakeholders have competing interests. And so these competing interests might result in conflict. The key example, so a really good example, is that employees, like we mentioned before, they want higher wages, and it's a cost of the business. Obviously, employee wages, labor, that's a cost to a business, which means that profits are going to decrease because it's an expense. On the contrary, shareholders, their interest is wanting high dividends, which can only come through good business performance and having high profits. Profits can be increased if employee wages were decreased. So that's a key conflict there because, employees want higher wages, and if a business were to increase those wages, that would increase the business's expenses. But that doesn't necessarily satisfy the interest of shareholders because they want high dividends. And so if the business increases the amount they're paying to their employees, that's going to decrease the profits, and shareholders aren't going to get as high of a dividend that they could be if those wages hadn't been increased. So that's a key room for conflict. Another example is that customers, they want access to high quality goods and services, and so shareholders, there might be a conflict there with shareholders and customers because shareholders want high dividends, and then if a business chooses to use high quality products and high quality materials when they're producing their products and services, that might come at a cost, and that might reduce shareholder dividends. Okay, now we have corporate culture. So corporate culture is the set of shared beliefs, values, and attitudes held by those within the business. When we're learning about corporate culture, we need to be aware of both real and official corporate culture. So real is the actual and established shared set of values, beliefs, and attitudes within an organization, and it's reflected by the workplace through behaviors such as celebration of rituals, events, and all of those. So it's the actual and think of real as what's that real or actual corporate culture within the business. And then official corporate culture is really just whatever is presented to the public. So it's the stated and documented outline of beliefs, values, and attitudes within an organization, and it's reflected by documentation such as the business's mission and vision statements. So it's really just what's ever presented to the public. And then with real corporate culture, no one from the public can actually understand real corporate culture. It can only be understood or seen through direct contact with the business because it's reflected through workplace behaviors such as rituals, events, all of that. So, some strategies that management could use to develop a desired culture at an organization, well, they could have a think about their management style, dress code, implementing rituals, thinking about setting an example, recruiting and selecting the right staff that will support and uphold their desired culture, providing training, reinforcing desired culture through meetings. So just small little things, some ways that they can, I guess, improve and develop a desired culture. Okay, now we're looking at management styles. So we have 5 different management styles that we need to be aware of. This table is really good in understanding these management styles because it tells you the definition, it has the direction of communication, and it has decision-making power. So when we're looking at all of these management styles, we're going to be looking at the direction of communication. So is it one-way or is it two-way communication? Or is it horizontal, which is between employees? So one-way communication is from manager to employees, and then two-way communication is manager to employees, but also employees to manager. So it's upwards, which is employees to manager, and downwards, manager to employees. Then we also need to be aware of the decision-making power. So is it centralized? Centralized decision-making means that the manager makes the decision, and then decentralized decision-making means that employees and management both have the ability to make decisions in the business. Okay, now let's have a look at each of the management styles. So the first one we have is autocratic. This is where communication is exclusively downwards and the manager makes all the decisions with no feedback. So essentially, there's a situation, the manager makes the decision, they're not consulting anyone, they're just making the decision and they're communicating that to the employees. In that way, direction of communication is one way, it's downwards from manager to employee, and there's going to be centralized decision making because the manager is the one making the decision. Then we have persuasive management style. So this is where management, they make the decision, so they're still the ones making the decision, but now they're just justifying or they are explaining the reasons of the decision to their employees. So it's still going to be one way because the manager is making the decision and they're justifying that decision to their employees. And it's going to be centralized decision making because the manager is still the one making the decision. Then we have consultative. So this is where the manager will consider the ideas and opinions of its employees before they are making the final decision. The direction of communication here is now two-way because the employees are going to be communicating their ideas and opinions to their manager. So it's going to be upwards communication, but also there's going to be downwards communication when the manager is making their final decision or when they are talking to employees from manager to employees. And the decision-making power is centralized because at the end, the manager is still the one making the final decision. Then we have participative. So this is where decision-making is shared between the manager and employee, and both parties are engaging in two-way communication. So decision-making is shared, and now there's two-way communication. So both parties have equal decision-making power. And then we have laissez-faire. So this is where decisions are completely left to the group. Managers give up all decision-making responsibility. They relinquish all decision-making responsibility. So direction of communication is horizontal because it's just between employees now. And decision-making power is decentralized because employees are just making decisions together. So this is where managers aren't really involved. So to summarize, autocratic. Manager is the one making decisions, communicating that to employees. Persuasive. Managers still making the final decision, but they're just justifying their decision to employees. Consultative. Manager will consider the ideas and opinions of employees before making the final decision. Participative, both employees and managers can make the decision. And then laissez-faire, employees, like managers relinquish responsibility, decision making responsibility, and it's just up to employees. Okay, so a quick one on advantages and disadvantages. I will quickly, I'm going to leave this table up here. I feel like we might come back to it at the end of the lecture if we have time, but I'm just in the interest of time, I might have to continue on. But maybe screenshot it or save it for reviewing, maybe at the end of the lecture. But this is just a little table of looking at the advantages and disadvantages among each style. Okay, with management styles, we also have to think about how appropriate management styles are. And when we're, I guess, determining the appropriateness of management styles, we have to think about the nature of the task. So is the task simple or complex? Is it classified or unopened? Is it unpopular but a necessary decision? And then how much time is required to make the decision? So is it a quick decision that needs to be made, or is there lots of time that can be taken? Do we have days? Do we have months? Do we have weeks to make the decision? What's the manager preference? So are they a good decision maker? Are they a good leader? Do they have good interpersonal skills? And also the experience of employees. So are the employees experienced? Could they be given some decision-making responsibility if they are experienced? Or are they new employees who are unaware of, the ways of their role? So for example, if a quick decision needs to be made, then the manager might take on more of an autocratic or persuasive style, because especially with an autocratic management style, a quick decision is being made. They don't have to spend justifying it or consulting employees to make the final decision. So that's just an example. Okay, let's have a look at this activity. So Ellie is a manager of a travel agency. She's been its manager for only 2 months and wants to introduce a key change, the development of a new customer service policy that improves the quality of the service provided to customers with the aim of reducing customer complaints. Ellie employs a team of 5 travel agents who each have more than 10 years of experience in the industry. Ellie does not believe the new policy to be urgent, but the sooner it is implemented at the travel agency, the better its performance. Justify a management style that would be the most appropriate for Ellie in this situation. So use all 4 measurements of appropriateness to justify your chosen management style. So I'll give you some time, maybe give you a couple of minutes, have a think about it, and we'll go through some potential responses. Okay, let's have a look. So, um, we can have a look at what ones we have to eliminate first. So the first thing we need to understand is employees' experience. So we should use them. There's an inexperienced manager, so they shouldn't be the one making the decision without help, and it's not suitable for this industry slash task. So, um, yeah. So those travel agents, she is a team of 5 travel agents who each have more than 10 years of experience in the industry. So they are a lot more knowledgeable than her. So in this case, we would say maybe using a consultative and participative style because when we're looking at the nature of task, it's open slash unclassified. So it would benefit from collaboration and a detailed discussion between everyone in the business. The time, so there's enough time for two-way communication. There's no time restriction, no time bound as such. And then the experience of employees, they're more experienced than the manager. So Ali would naturally want to welcome their input and ideas. And in this case, participative has more of an edge because employees can also help to make the final decision as well. And it kind of also restricts for any biases to occur. And then manager preference, the manager is inexperienced. The employees in this case have a lot more experience than her, again, putting an edge to participative. Okay, we also need to be aware of our management skills. So we have communication. This is the transfer of information between one person to another person. Delegation, this is looking at the shift of responsibility from handing out, it's really just looking at handing down tasks and responsibility to subordinates. Decision making, this is the ability to understand and highlight alternative solutions to a problem and then select which one is the most appropriate. Planning, it's all about involves deciding in advance the steps the organization wants to take in order to reach an objective. Leading is all about influencing and motivating staff to achieve their business objectives. And then interpersonal skills is all about the ability to relate and empathize with others and build effective relationships with each other. Also important to think about the relationship and the connections of different management skills and management styles. So for example, when consider if a management style has two-way or one-way communication, or if they use centralized or decentralized decision making to help you if it suits a skill or not. So for example, persuasive management styles, the important skills would be communicating because they would need to clearly explain instructions and justify their decision. Delegating must clearly articulate tasks to employees because they might be, delegating some sense of responsibility. And the decision making, they have all the decision making power, so it depends on their own ideas. Consultative, leading would be important because they need to align everyone to a shared goal. They need to motivate the team. Interpersonal skills, so manage debate with care, reject people's input empathetically. That's really important because consultative, there's that two-way communication. So the manager needs to be really careful in not making employees feel rejected if their ideas aren't included in the decision making. Communication, so two-way communication, they must speak well but also be able to listen well too to their ideas of their employees. All right, now let's have a look at the second area of study. So this is managing employees. So the task words of this one that we need to be aware of is obviously your standard identify, define, describe, and apply, interpret, discuss, and compare, evaluate. The emphasis is put on examining and applying theories, so also be prepared to do that as well. Okay, so we need to think about the relationship between managing employees and their objectives. Before I do that, just have a think to yourself, how might the effective management of employees actually help a business to achieve its objectives? Give you like a minute to have a think about that. Okay, let's have a little look at this. So, the effective management of employees. This will help to. Okay, so first of all, effective management of employees means that the business is going to have a lot more motivated employees, but also well-trained and effective employees as well. So um, we'll go through motivated employees first. So if the business has more motivated employees, they're more likely to stay within the business. So that's going to decrease staff turnover. Remember, staff turnover is all about, it's just where the business is, it's sort of the figure that measures the rate at which employees are leaving the business but need to be replaced. So that's what we mean by turnover. So employees are going to be staying within the business. That's going to decrease staff turnover. It's also going to mean that there's going to be higher employee productivity and efficiency. Even if you think about in your own life, if you're really motivated, if you really enjoy a subject, you're going to be a lot more motivated and you're going to spend more time and effort towards that subject because you genuinely enjoy what you're doing. So you're going to be a lot more productive, you're going to be a lot more efficient. Same thing, same sort of idea here. And in this way, there's going to be decreased cost for the business because they don't have to spend time replacing employees who are leaving the business. And if the employees are productive, if they're efficient, that means they're going to be producing more output, providing a greater quality service, whatever it might be. So it's going to be decreased costs, and that means there's going to be higher profit. So that's the key business objective there. And then on the other side, well-trained and effective employees. That means that outputs are of higher quality, greater customer satisfaction and business reputation. A key example here is maybe for a service business like a bank, if the business incorporates good training, so if they actually train their employees maybe around how to use the computer or the software, that means that employees are more familiar and they can, when they are dealing with customers, they are providing more of a quick service because they're familiar with that software. They're not spending time asking around on how to do a particular thing. And so customers are going to be more satisfied. The business is going to have a higher reputation. It's going to be more sales, and also higher market share as well because of greater sales. Obviously, this is a very general explanation. In your responses and your SACs, you should try to be as specific as possible, but this just provides you a good depiction on how you really need to tell a story with your explanation. Like really break every single thing up. You don't just want to be saying effective management of employees leads to higher sales and higher market share. You need to really tell me, how does it increase sales? What is it specifically doing? And that's when you're going to be talking about, well, if the business implements training, it's going to mean that employees are a lot more confident, which means that outputs are of higher quality. That means, there's greater satisfaction, which means people are going to come back to the business, higher sales, then higher market share. So you can see that difference in answer. So really, really demonstrate your understanding, tell a story, and break each point up. Okay, then we have motivation theories. With motivation theories, we're required to know 3 theories of motivation, and those are listed on the screen as shown now. The first theory of motivation is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. These are where human needs are arranged on a hierarchy, and they need to be fulfilled in sequential order from down up. But it's the unsatisfied need above a person in the hierarchy that is the source of motivation. And we'll go through that in the next slide. But it's a visual. We'll see the visual depiction of the hierarchy, but it's just needs that are looking to actually motivate the individual. Then we have Locke and Latham's goal-setting theory. This is where motivation is derived from setting and attaining goals. So it's all about goal setting and keeping in mind that those goals need to be challenging, set jointly. They should be specific, monitored, and also be given feedback. Then we have Lawrence and Nahoria's 4-drive theory. This is where motivation is derived from 4 basic needs that act to drive people. Those are the drive to bond, acquire, learn, and defend. So when we're looking at the first theory of motivation, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, these are the key principles. So the hierarchy of needs is Maslow's representation of human needs in the form of a pyramid, and it's ranging from the least fundamental needs at the bottom to the most fundamental at the top. An employee is placed on the hierarchy based on what needs they have already fulfilled. So the employee is motivated to achieve the unsatisfied need above them in the hierarchy, and once they achieve that need, they can then move up the hierarchy. So this is the hierarchy. So we have physiological needs, we have safety needs, social needs, esteem needs, and self-actualization needs. So they need to be fulfilled in sequential order. So for example, if someone's fulfilled their physiological needs, they can't then look to fulfill their social needs. They have to look at the next one above. So then safety needs is the source of motivation. And that's what the business is going to look to fulfill to motivate the employee. So these are some examples of what the specific needs are really looking at. So the first one, physiological needs. This is related to physical requirements of the employee. It's also important to understand, this is just a little pointer, but a lot of people get this confused with psychological needs. There's no psychological needs, it's physiological needs. So again, be careful with your terminology and your spelling as well in the SAC. It's really easy to mix up the spelling of this specific need. So make sure that you, again, practice and really drill it in you that it's physiological need, because you don't want to be making that silly mistake. Okay, it provides employees with appropriate wages that allow them to meet their physiological needs. So water, food, shelter. So some ways a business might look to satisfy physiological needs is ensure the employee has access to a safe working environment, has access to water, has access to air conditioning, has access to an office table, has access to a fan. But it's just looking at the physical requirements of the employee and ensuring that those needs are being met. Then we have safety needs. So that could include job security, having a safe work environment that is in line with occupational health and safety standards. Then we have social needs. So having friendly associates, being set collaborative tasks which allow the employee to build relationships with other people within the business, having access to a positive corporate culture. So again, having rituals, having celebrations. Then esteem needs. So, that could be achieved through promotion, job titles, extra responsibility, having access to prestigious facilities. Then self-actualization. So having a challenging and creative work environment, having access to opportunities for growth and development, which help to, allow the employee to achieve their potential. All right. Then we have Locke and Latham's goal setting theory. So the first, thing when goals are being set, it needs to be ensured that they're being challenging. So when we're looking at challenging, it's just looking at ensuring that the goal, has enough challenge so that it requires hard work and demands motivation. And also, when the employee actually achieves that goal, they'll get a sense of achievement from achieving a challenging goal. And that's a key drive to, continue achieving their other goals as well. Goals should also be set jointly. So this is where the employee and manager actually develop the goals together, just so that when the manager is helping the employee to develop those goals, that they're also in line with business goals, so that when the employee achieves their goals, that also translates to the achievement of business objectives as well. And then it also means that, if they're set jointly, that goals are more likely to be specific for the employee and therefore more likely to motivate them in the long term too. They should also be specific, so goals should be clearly defined. They should avoid vagueness. It means that the employee knows exactly, what's expected of them, what they're directing their energy to, and avoids it being ambiguous or directing their energy in the wrong ways. Should also be monitored. So manager is responsible for keeping track of employees' progress towards their goals over time, but also providing extra support for employees who may need it if they fall behind in their progress. And then also being given feedback. So not receiving recognition can often demotivate individuals and employees. So being recognized for their hard work is also a key source of motivation. And it allows managers to also advise employees on how to improve performance in the future. So kind of like a little heads up of things employees can keep in mind when they are looking at achieving other goals in the future too. So it's also just understanding that it's a cycle. So all of them are kind of like interrelated, interconnected. Okay, then we have Lawrence and Nahoria's four drive theory. This proposes that individuals are motivated to achieve four basic needs. These are known as drives. So these drives need to be met simultaneously and in balance. And with the four drives, these are the drive to acquire, drive to bond, drive to learn, and the drive to defend. Keeping in mind that the drive to defend is a latent drive. It only is activated when there is a threat in the workplace. Let's have a look at each of these drives. So we have the drive to acquire. The ways that a business could, I guess, address or look to appeal to these drives. The drive to acquire is rewarding individuals with praise, recognition, and interesting assignments. It's done through performance management. So it's really just looking at the employee's drive to achieve more, I guess. So really looking at, it could be financial and non-financial ways. So yeah, praise, recognition, interesting assignments, performance management. And then drive to bond, we have encouraging teamwork, setting collaborative tasks, which provide the opportunity to bond and build relationships with other people in the business, but also having celebratory events and rituals, maintaining a culture of a team spirit, openness, and pride. And then drive to learn, so ensuring tasks are actually interesting and challenging, tasks that actually stimulate employees and mentally engage them as well, and also offer training opportunities. So that's another good way of adhering to that drive or appealing to that drive, because training opportunities allow employees to upskill themselves and give them that confidence to better perform their role. And then drive to defend, I guess ways that business could avoid activating this drive is having a participative management style, involving employees, implementing policies for dispute resolution, and then also having a supportive workplace. Okay, then we have our motivation strategies. So motivation strategies, I'm going to quickly go through them. We have performance-related pay. So performance-related pay is rewarding employees based on their performance. So it's monetarily rewarding employees based on their performance. Some examples of performance-related pay is commission, it's bonuses. So higher performance would correlate to higher pay. So for example, with a commission, if a employee sells higher volume of a particular product, they're going to get higher commission, because maybe that commission is per product. So if they're selling more of that product, they're going to get more commission. With performance-related pay, this only appeals specifically to short-term motivation, because with any financial reward, that's looking at extrinsic motivation, so it's only going to motivate employees in the short term. Career advancement, it's going to motivate both in the short term and long term, because it's looking at the self-actualization and the self-esteem of employees. Then we have investment in training, again going to motivate in the short term and the long term, because it's looking at upskilling and self-esteem of individuals, the intrinsic motivation of individuals as well. And then support strategies, so when we're looking at support strategies, maybe having an open door policy, allowing employees the opportunity to feel supported, and that support being provided by management. So that's going to be a short-term and a long-term motivator. And then sanction strategies, examples being manipulation and threat, that's only going to be a short-term motivator, because it's not sustainable to use in the long term. So if management use sanction strategies in the long term, that can impact the relationship they have with employees, because it's going to make employees feel threatened, and the key source of motivation there is through fear. So it's not very sustainable, as you can imagine, because employees are going to leave the business if it's used in the long term. So it's only just going to motivate in the short term. Okay. Then we have training. So with training, we have two different types of training methods a business can use. Our first type of training, an example of training, is on-the-job training. So on-the-job training is essentially when training is occurring while the business is performing their actual duties and roles. The advantages with on-the-job training is that it allows the employee to become familiar with their equipment that they're going to be using when performing their actual job. It's also often cost effective because it's someone within the business already conducting the training, and it's also efficient. So there's no loss of productivity because all employees are actually working while being trained. They're completing their actual job while being trained. So it's quite efficient in that sense. And it's tailored to the business, so their needs, their role, their methods of completing their tasks. So it's quite specific to the business. And there's a mentor on hand for support after training as well. The disadvantages of on-the-job training is that the mentor might be ineffective, so potentially poor habits passed on. Poor habits of that mentor might be passed on to employees. So it might be a particular way they do things, and if that's not necessarily right, those habits are going to be passed on to the employees because they're the ones that are being trained. Experienced employees taken away from their own duties. So the person who is actually conducting the training, they might be, taken away from their normal duties, and there might be a loss of productivity because they're the one conducting the training. They're not going to be performing the actual job and task. So a bit of productivity lost there. Okay, then we have off-the-job training. This is where training is occurring outside the workplace and away from the normal roles and duties of the actual employee. The advantages here is that training is being conducted by specialists and experts. So this is quite valuable because these tend to be, these people have a lot of expertise and knowledge in their field, and therefore they can really effectively tailor training and, educate employees on, that particular area of training. There's going to be less workplace interruptions because it's occurring outside the workplace. So for example, some examples of off-the-job training is lectures, seminars, conferences, and so those environments tend to have less interruptions. Then we have opportunities for networking. So again, employees can actually meet other employees, maybe other people from other industries, but also, have a conversation with those specialists and experts, and get their details, which could be handy later down in their career. And then this is another really key advantage of the job training, but the employees or anyone who completes off the job training gets access to a formal qualification. So they get a certificate after completing this form of training, but they get a formal qualification. The disadvantages of off-the-job training is that it does tend to be more expensive. There is a loss of working time / output because employees are being taken away from their, working environment to another environment for the training to be conducted in. So they aren't, working while they are being trained. And so they might also have, when they are being trained, they might be trained on different equipment. So when they come back to the business, they might need to implement on-the-job training so that they get used to their actual equipment that they're using. And they might some employees might use those qualifications to leave the business. Okay. Just going to see how much we have left. Okay. Okay, then we have performance management strategies. So with management objectives, this is one performance management strategy a business can use, but it's a participative setting where a manager and an employee, they jointly determine a set of objectives and goals, and then at the end of the review period, the performance is measured against those established objectives. So it's all about establishing those objectives with the manager and then reviewing them, and sort of the efficiency of the employee and achieving those objectives with the manager. And then we have performance appraisals. So just keep in mind with performance management, it's all about looking at assessing the performance of employees, if just so that you're aware when we're looking at all of these strategies. Okay, that's just a side note. Anyways, performance appraisals, this is the process used to measure an individual's performance over a set period of time. It's where the manager, so the appraiser, and the employee, which is the appraisee, they come together to then discuss the employee's performance over that period of time. So with appraisals, they measure how well the employees actually performed their job. They provide feedback to the employees, and then they also establish plans to improve future performance as well. Then we have self-evaluation. This is when the employee assesses their own performance. So they rate their own performance in a number of areas, and then the ratings are then compared to those completed by a manager, and then the differences are discussed. And then we have employee observation. This involves the collection of feedback relating to an employee's performance from other employees, other managers, or customers. So examples of this could be 360-degree feedback or mystery shoppers as well. All right, then we have termination management. So with termination management, we have two forms of termination. So we have voluntary termination and we have involuntary termination. Voluntary termination is where the employee themselves are taking the initiative to, end that formal relationship with the employer and the employee. And then involuntary is when the employer takes that initiative to end the contract or end that relationship with the employee. And under voluntary termination, we have resignation and retirement. And under involuntary, we have redundancy and dismissal. So when we're looking at resignation firstly, this occurs when an employee leaves the workplace, usually to go to another job. And it requires a period of notice to be given. An exit interview is also recommended so that, the employer can understand the reasons behind the employee's decision in terms of them wanting to leave to go to another job. And then retirement is when an employee decides to leave the paid workforce entirely. So they're leaving the paid workforce entirely, not to go to another place, but they're entitled to accrued entitlements, as with resignation. Also, don't get mixed up between these two. So resignation is when they're leaving the workplace to go to another workplace. But retirement is when they're leaving the entire paid workforce. So don't mix up workplace and workforce, because again, if you get those mixed up, can lose you easy marks. Okay, then we have redundancy. So redundancy is termination of employment by an employer because the employer no longer needs a particular job to be done or needs fewer people for the type of job. That is, the job no longer exists. So to put it in a much easier way, redundancy just means when the job that the employee is employed under or that they're carrying out no longer exists. So therefore that employee is redundant because they have no job. That job that they're completing actually, ceases to exist. It no longer exists. It no longer needs to be done. And therefore the employer makes the employee redundant. So that's why it's an involuntary form of termination. Some causes of redundancy, some things, just to keep in mind into why might people be made redundant, might be because of restructuring of the business. Maybe the business isn't doing so well and they need to restructure. They need to get rid of particular jobs that might not necessarily contribute to the value of the business. And so they might restructure, they might, eliminate some jobs, and therefore some people might be made redundant. Another key reason, a common reason nowadays, is because of technology. A good example could be, implementation of self-serve checkouts in grocery stores. So a lot of people, when that was implemented, were made redundant because not as many people were needed to actually help check out the items of customers because they were doing it themselves through self-serve checkouts. So tends to be another one. And then even with AI, again, replacing jobs. That's also a good example. You've probably heard a lot about that as well. Then the third one is that it could occur when the business must urgently save its costs or is, on the verge of bankruptcy. So that's also why people are made redundant, because it's a call for help to save costs. Okay. Then the other involuntary form of termination that we have is dismissal. So this is an involuntary form of termination, often because of incompetence or indiscipline, but it's where the business must have taken disciplinary procedures before dismissal. It's not taken lightly, so they would have had to take other procedures before they resort to dismissal, because it's not taken lightly. You're essentially firing someone. But if an employee is perceived to be unfairly dismissed, there are a number of ways that they can take, of steps that they can take with the Fair Work Commission or Fair Work Australia to restore their employment rights. But it's not something that is done commonly. It's not common because the business has to prove that they've taken, prior disciplinary procedures, and those have failed before they've chosen to actually act dismissal. Okay, then we need to also understand the different legal entitlements that are applicable to the different forms of termination. So redundancy pay, that's just when employees receive they receive pay based on their continuous period of service with the employer. An employee's base rate of pay is used to calculate their redundancy payment. And then notice of termination. So with redundancy, they must provide a written notice of the day of termination, and the resignation employer must alert employee of the date they intend to resign. So that's sort of the entitlement that from the employer's side, with resignation, that the employee has to carry out. And then redundancy, just sort of providing a written day of a notice of termination. And then payment of accrued long service leave. So it applies, this legal entitlement applies to all forms of termination, just as long as the employee continuously worked at the business for at least 7 years. So there's just that requirement. There's also transition issues that you need to be aware of, but all that means is that the business can provide greater support, maybe providing outplacement services. That's an example, to support employees in finding another job. So for example, through redundancy, that's often a step that employees might take just to maintain that positive relationship with employees to support them to find another job. All right. We also need to be aware of the different participants in the workplace. So we need to know the roles of these participants and how they contribute to workplace relations. So the first one we have is human resource managers. So their role is to operate as a bridge between employees and management by balancing out their interests and representing those interests during negotiations. So they also need to be aware of awards and maybe changes in award rates, and they should be knowledgeable enough to provide advice on awards as well. They have to negotiate pay and conditions, plan meetings between employees and management if there's a potential dispute, or if employees want to talk about a particular issue to management. As they should also assist in resolving disputes, staying up to date with legislative changes, but also be able to drop job descriptions and contracts when necessary. So that's just some of their roles. And then we have roles of employees. So they should be able to prioritize themselves and negotiate with management when necessary, usually for better pay / wages and / or working conditions. And those demands might be at odds with management's desire for business growth. So really, employees, their role is to prioritize themselves, make sure they're getting good pay, good working conditions, etc. Employer associations are a group of employers who unite to promote common interests in workplace relations. So they essentially just represent employers in the collective bargaining process. We'll learn about that in the next couple of slides. And then advise employers on their rights and responsibilities, and also lobby to the government in support of employers. Then we have unions. So unions, they are organizations of employees. They're formed to represent and protect the rights of workers in a particular industry. And they are responsible for, negotiating wages for their members during the collective bargaining process. They would also provide support and advice to members and, inform them of their rights, and then organize industrial actions on behalf of members if necessary, and then provide assistance and support to individual employees too. Okay, then we have the Fair Work Commission. The Fair Work Commission is Australia's independent national workplace relations tribunal. They are responsible for creating and maintaining awards. They dictate minimum wages and working conditions for specific industry. So they're like the big boss. They have a lot of power. They have a lot of legislative power because they are a government body. They also provide assistance with the resolution of workplace disputes. So if there's any workplace disputes, they play a key role in, mitigating that if it's through arbitration, but also they can act as a mediator, which is that third point. And then also ensuring good faith during enterprise bargaining, signing off on workplace agreements as well. All right. A lot of this will make sense. A lot of the terminology will make sense in these next couple of slides, because we're now talking about determining wages and conditions. So there are two ways that workplace wages and conditions are determined, and those are through industry-wide awards and enterprise agreements. So when we're looking at an award, this is really just looking at a legally binding minimum requirement for wages and conditions for a specific industry. So it's sort of like the bare minimum that an employer has to comply by in relation to, their wages and conditions in the workplace. It's also legally binding. So they are determined and they're reviewed by the Fair Work Commission every 4 years, but it's legally binding. So if the employer doesn't comply by an award as a bare minimum, it's illegal. They're gonna get in trouble because whatever they're doing is illegal if they're not complying by this. It's the minimum requirement, so they must surpass the national employment standards, and it acts as a safety net for employees as well. And it's also it's industry specific. So all industries have their own awards. There's an aviation award, there's a retail award, there's an hospitality award, and all of these awards are going to be different because they're industry specific. Okay, and then we have enterprise agreements. So these are written collective agreements made between employers and employees at a workplace. They are applicable to a single workplace only. So it's between an employer and employee at a workplace, which means it's only applying to a single workplace. And then, which just means, so for example, an enterprise agreement negotiated within McDonald's isn't going to be the same one negotiated within Hungry Jack's. So they're all going to be different because they're different workplaces. They are negotiated during the enterprise bargaining period, and they also have to be approved by the Fair Work Commission. They need to pass the Better Off Overall test. They need to have a grievance procedure, meet the national employment standards, and have an expiry date. Okay, we're going to quickly go through the similarities and differences between awards and agreements. So the key similarities is that they both deal with terms and conditions of employment. They both have to adhere to the national employment standards, which are set by the Fair Work Commission, and they're a safety net for all industries. And they both have to involve unions in the negotiation process. The key differences is that awards are set by the Fair Work Commission for the entire industry, whereas an agreement applies only to a single organization or workplace. And then enterprise agreements provide for incentives linked to productivity, while awards do not. So enterprise agreements can be tailored specifically to the business. So they can incorporate more incentives, etc., while awards, again, just set the bare minimum. The Fair Work Commission determines awards, but only approves enterprise agreements. So Fair Work Commission has no say in enterprise agreements. They're only simply approving it for it to be legal. And then disputes with agreements are usually resolved in the organization, whereas disputes with awards are resolved through the Fair Work Commission. Okay, now we're going to be looking at dispute resolution. There are two dispute resolution processes that we need to be aware of. Those are mediation and arbitration. So this is a good table, which again just summarizes both of them. But mediation, it's a formal method of dispute resolution where an independent third party facilitates the discussion and parties come to their own resolution. So if there's a dispute, essentially a third party, they're facilitating discussion. They're getting both the parties to come to a resolution. The advantages is that the mediator might be effective in aiding negotiation, and it can be effective in therefore providing a resolution or resulting in a resolution after the parties after discussion through the parties. Both parties are more likely to be satisfied as each has to agree to the established path forward or the resolution. It's also less expensive and formal. The disadvantages is that mediation can fail. If it's a very complex situation, parties might not necessarily come to a resolution, and therefore they might need to escalate to arbitration. But also, it's not legally binding. So even if they come to a resolution, they could deter from it because it's not legally binding. Arbitration. It's a method of dispute resolution where both parties put their cases forward to an independent third party who then makes the final legally binding decision. The advantages is that a resolution will be achieved. So regardless of whatever the situation is, ultimately a resolution will be made. It's also legally enforceable. It's a long-term resolution because it's legally enforceable. So if parties don't adhere to it, then it's illegal. It's also impartial and fair. So it's a third party, an independent third party. They're making the decision. So therefore, there's no biases. They're not siding with one side. And disadvantages is that the parties might not be content with the outcome, and it could result in a poor corporate culture. And it tends to be a lot more costly and formal because it's a court environment, a lot of the cases. Okay, we're going to quickly go, I guess now we're looking at the SAC tips. We've looked at both of the area of studies. So in this last part, I'm just going to, I guess, stress some important points of BizMan, and just some important reminders that you should take with you when you are completing the subject. So I mentioned this at the start of the lecture, but understanding task words is really important. It's a key skill for success in BizMan, but you'll learn them over time. But just start as early as possible. These are a list of task words that tend to be the most common and that, tend to come up quite frequently in SACs and exams. And then SAC tips. So it's really important that when you are completing your SACs or, the day of your SAC, or whenever you are completing your SAC, that you get a good sleep the night before. But make sure you get enough rest. Don't be cramming until 2 a.m. because you want your brain to be as refreshed as possible when you step foot into the exam, when you're entering into the exam. So do make sure that you do get a good night's sleep before. Try to finish all note taking at least a week prior as well before the SAC. And spend the remaining time doing practice questions just so that, you're walking in there, you feel confident, but also you're not cramming anything last minute. I feel like cramming it's ineffective just because your brain can't retain that much information in a short period of time. It takes a while for it to really stick with you. So do make sure that you give yourself sufficient time for revising, but also focusing on your weak areas so that you are, targeting your revision so that it's going to focus on helping you improve and maximize your marks on the SAC. Always plan out your longer responses as well. So I feel like with the higher mark questions, it's easy to get overwhelmed. So a good strategy you can use is just making sure that you come up with a effective plan so that, you can structure your response better. You're not leaving anything out. It's just overall a lot more effective. You also want to make sure that you use all of your reading and writing time effectively. So don't use your reading time staring at the time or staring at a blank wall because you've read all your questions. Start planning out your responses. So use your reading time as a way of maybe coming up with a strategy of what questions you want to answer first, and what you might say in particular for particular questions. And then always with your writing time, make sure that you do give enough time that give enough time for yourself to go back and reread through your responses and go through questions so that you avoid making the same mistakes, or that you avoid making mistakes or making silly mistakes. The other really important thing to do is don't talk to your friends after the exam or SAC, because I feel like discussing the SAC can sometimes add to the stress or add to your stress, because you're going to get worried that if you answered a particular question correctly, or if you forgot to answer a question. So I feel like sometimes it can make you a bit more stressed than you need to after a SAC. Okay. This is a little question. Oh no, it's just an example, but yeah, this is a practice question. Discuss partnerships as a type of business with 4 marks. So this is the sample response. It's not a sample response. We have to mark the answer. But when I'm reading through it, just think about how many marks out of 4 this should receive. So one advantage is that partnerships are easy to set up. Another advantage is that they offer great access to capital as a startup. However, one disadvantage of a partnership is that it has unlimited liability. Another disadvantage is that it lacks perpetuity. It would be 1 out of 4, 0 if your examiner is in a bad mood. This is because it's not asking you to list the advantages or disadvantages. You have to kind of expand upon it. So what the student has done is they've just listed the advantages and their disadvantages. They haven't really demonstrated their knowledge. So in BizMan, it's not enough to just memorize advantages and disadvantages. You need to be confident enough to actually talk about them as well. So ways we can improve this answer. So one advantage is that partnerships are easy to set up, ensuring higher time efficiency. Another advantage is that they offer greater access to capital as a startup because multiple owners are contributing their finances. However, one disadvantage of a partnership is that it has unlimited liability. Unlimited liability is when owners and the business are considered separate legal entities. Subsequently, if the business falls into debt, both personal and business assets can be seized to pay off that debt. Another disadvantage is that partnerships lack perpetuity, which refers to the ability of a business to survive into the long term because they can easily dissolve if partners no longer wish to work together. So just notice that difference between that first response and this response. This is a lot more specific to the question in terms of addressing that discuss task word. All right, and then final advice is have a good note-taking strategy. So try to keep in mind from the get-go how you want to take your notes and keep it up the whole year, because you don't want to be disorganized for the exam, or even just your SACs if you've been switching note-taking strategy from having half of your notes on your laptop and half of your notes handwritten. I would recommend handwriting your notes because I think it's the best in sort of just learning and understanding the content. I started off the year typing my notes, but I think handwriting them definitely does make a difference. It is a bit more time consuming, but I think it's time consuming because it helps you really retain what you're learning about. And then it's also important to be consistent with your note taking as well, because you don't want to be taking notes during the exam period. You don't want to be learning content in the exam period, because that's the period you should be using revising and consolidating your current knowledge so that it sticks with you. Because learning is a big process. It's about learning the content, but also consolidating your understanding so that you can confidently talk about it in a SAC or exam. Also, don't get on your teacher's bad side. Suck up to your teacher. They're the one who are going to be marking your SACs. So you want to be on their good side so that, maybe there's a chance they give you better marks. So always be on their good side. Also, just have a good relationship with them, because I find whenever you have a good relationship with your teacher, you're more comfortable asking them questions and, asking them for feedback. I think that's really valuable. So do ensure that you use them so that, you're learning and where you need to improve. And then also get on top of your definitions early. Don't fall behind in your notes either, because catching up is a nightmare because it easily adds up. You don't want to be like I said, in the exam period, taking notes, learning definitions, because if you did that at the start of the year, if you did that before your SAC, then, you would have been on top of it. You would have got a higher mark on your SAC anyways. So be organized, plan out your time, and I guess, yeah, always make sure that you have enough time to prioritize your study as well. And then ask every question you have. No question is a dumb or stupid question. It's really important that you clarify, your understanding, and you're clear with your understanding, because the worst feeling is getting, on a SAC, having a question, or getting a question, and then you realizing that was a question you had wanted to ask your teacher. So I've been there and I didn't ask it. So just always ask your question. If anything, you're not losing anything, you're getting more knowledge and understanding from it. So make sure that, you ask every single question you have. Handwriting is also really important. If your handwriting is bad, fix it now, because your teacher or the examiner cannot give you marks for what they cannot read. So ensure that your handwriting is legible, answer questions fully, make sure that you answer every part of the question, make sure that you highlight, break it down if you need to. And that brings us to like the last point as well, is always highlight the task words, just so that in your head visually you know how to structure your answer. So if it's an identify, describe, or evaluate, you're highlighting that so that you know how to structure your answer as well. But yeah, highlight, break it apart, underline content, really just annotate the question so that you can break it apart, you really understand it fully. Okay, as I mentioned before, continue asking questions you have in the live chat. I will be answering them, but that brings us to the end of the lecture for today. If you have any other questions, feel free to put them into the live chat. Otherwise, I will see you all next time.